Hey guys, welcome back. In my last video, a lot of people commented that I have a less than satisfactory background on my videos. And to that I say, unfortunately, I am a messy person. A lot of us are messy people. I don't have the best camera quality or the best background, but I think all of us need to share our opinions and engage in more discourse about the world around us. So if you'd be so kind as to ignore my less than Hollywood background, I would be so kind to has discussed the important things going on with you guys. So I just finished Euphoria, and like it or not, watch it or not, it is very much an important kind of tennis game with the cultural zeitgeist where it's simultaneously creating and critiquing the society we live in nowadays. When this show first came out, I was a bit younger and maybe closer in age to some of the characters, wherein now I find it so fascinating that a lot of the characters are experiencing adult situations and that I've grown the same time as the characters. However, I recall telling adults in my life that it's a very good show and it's very culturally relevant back in the day because it was one of the few shows commenting on issues like drug abuse or sexual issues with young people and things like that that I think a lot of shows were too scared to touch. One thing about Euphoria is it's never been scared to dip a toe in the water. It's never been scared to open a dialogue. Now, does it have any credibility to do so? Does it have a good, inspiring message to send? Not always. But like my messy background, I think it's important to dive in and comment on these things that we know are going on. One of the biggest topics of this video was the fentanyl crisis. And I actually forgot I made some notes on this video. If you'd be so kind as to let me grab them as I walk through my messy house. But fentanyl is an issue in our society that a lot of people were not trying to talk about. And I recall in my own neighborhood, there was once a billboard about fentanyl abuse. And I remember being shocked at how kind of jarring it was, considering that a lot of people were trying to ignore this issue. I remember kind of thinking, oh, that's shocking to see on a billboard in the neighborhood above coffee shops when I know people who have actually passed away from fentanyl. So it is very much a jarring issue, and I appreciate how, and obviously there might be a few spoilers. I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil the show for you, but there will be some commentary. But if you've not watched the show, these topics are still important to discuss. What kind of messages are we sending out? And what kind of issues in America do we glamorize for the sake of entertainment, especially for young people who may be using shows like this as a way to learn about the world around them? I remember discourse in the past that adult content or video games that are violent were what young people were using to learn about real world issues as opposed to facts and credible information. And I think Euphoria could somewhat be a parallel for that, although I'm not sure if the target audience of Euphoria is exactly high schoolers anymore. I notice the age range is going higher and higher, so I do find the content of adults getting in financial crises and things like this a bit more relevant for the age group that it was originally targeted to, given the 4 years or so that have passed. So I would like to commend Euphoria first for bringing awareness to fentanyl in the most recent episode. I think somewhat breaking the fourth wall and preaching to the audience was a very good touch. And I commend Sam Levinson for using his platform to actually, do that. So yeah, and obviously everything in this is my personal opinion. You may feel differently. So I definitely enjoyed that. I do think this whole video has a Quentin Tarantino-esque vibe to it, and I argue that Quentin Tarantino is a past Sam Levinson. Now, am I personally a fan of Sam Levinson? Not quite. However, I have seen his other show, The Idol, which I feel also brings awareness to the cult-like mentality of Hollywood with the sex, drugs, violence, and mind control going on. Not literally. I'm not a alien conspiracy theorist, whatever. But I do think he rips open this discourse that has long been closed in America with no fear of how he's going to pave the way. And I do think culturally we're in a good point to be brave and to kind of move forward. I'm an Aries, so I love that energy. Me making my YouTube videos, getting told the background is bad or that I'm complaining, I think more so than ever, with the absolute absurdism going on in the world around us, we have more than a right to critique it, rip it wide open, and not be afraid of the implications of discussing those topics. Even so, I think things like race or, Happy Pride Month. We love our LGBT community, but bringing up these issues, I think a lot of people are not always ready to, have this discourse. And I think it's good. I think you should do it. I think you shouldn't be afraid. Say what you want to say. You deserve it. That's what we're here to do. So I do find that Sam Levinson's use of very jarring images and problematically the female body as kind of a motif of suffering or sexuality or whatever he intends it to be in that particular episode is very Quentin Tarantino-esque. And I do recall before Euphoria coming out feeling that Quentin Tarantino was a problematic filmmaker from a female perspective, and this I pointed out to my dad, and he was kind of shocked because people tend to render him as one of the greats without thinking, what kind of form do women take in his films? Like, just for example, in Pulp Fiction, I found that women tend to take a very passive role, very much either a problem, something to be looked after, a symbol, something very, bimbo-ish. And I noticed Cassie in this season is one of the most hated characters. She is so much of a bimbo, so much sexualized, so much not in on her own exploitation that many females are actually rage baited to the point of ignoring this show. And again, the portrayal of sex workers has also rage baited many women and sex workers into not watching the show, because it gets to a point where they're asking, why are our perspectives being highlighted in a way to kind of dramatize and exacerbate existing issues that you could have used your platform to bring awareness to? So on one hand, we have him using something gender neutral like the fentanyl crisis in America as, kind of a PSA to the audience, which I really like and think was a splendid use of all the pent up emotion you get watching this show. But on the other hand, I think with female issues, it really falls flat. And there were a lot of scenes, very Tarantino-esque, where I asked myself, why did he have to include this? Like, there were scenes that felt like, an elementary school kid directed it. Like, oh, it'd be really funny or gross or cool if we show, like, bodily fluids. And I was just asking myself, did we really have to do that? Since due to the duration of the show, I frequently like watch my dinner and eat the weekly episode. And there were definitely moments I kind of looked away, or I was like, I need to stop eating this for a minute. So I think, and with Cassie being the most talked about character, I watched a video where they said Sydney Sweeney and Cassie are becoming synonymous because they're both kind of they're passive to their own exploitation. And, it turns into this discourse we see online a lot nowadays where it's like, are women leaning into sex work or self-exploitation for, are they lucid in this decision to do these things? And it's a very important question. Again, a tennis game back and forth where we're simultaneously creating and critiquing the culture. So I do think that's important to speak up. And I think Euphoria, for this niche group of people in my kind of fish bubble, has been really a cultural reset in the zeitgeist of sex work, drug use, all of these pressing issues that often don't get a good authority commenting on them. And is Sam Levinson a good authority? I think not. But I will commend him as a filmmaker, creating this cinematic kind of universe in which we can take a critical look at just how extra the issues facing America are. And with early Euphoria or The Idol, we ask ourselves, do we need the nude female body as an absolute medium to convey these things? One character who is a worker in a strip club gets a BBL, and her BBL is the focal point of so much of the episode. And then when there's a very important scene, she's just used as kind of like a side character in a magic show to do various tasks. And I asked myself, is her objectification contributing anything meaningful to the show? I think from a female lens, a lot of people would have preferred maybe to see her childhood, what led her into this role, what her perception is, or maybe even do it from her perspective. But a big thing I noticed from Sam Levinson is who he chooses to give a backstory in which they get a first person kind of narrative. Like Rue, who is kind of like me, kind of non-binary looking, gets to be the narrator for all the women. She's in a strip club and she always has all her clothes on. She is not the one, taking off her clothes or being sexualized. She's kind of like the reliable narrator among all of these women that we can almost gawk at or blame for being in their state, despite the undertones that these women are somewhat being trafficked and not there of their own volition. Maddie is another woman who is given this kind of almost Andrew Tate Dream Woman-esque characterization where it's like no matter what happens, Maddie is not degraded. Even her own degradation, she is above it. Wherein Cassie really kind of takes into it. She becomes her degradation. And, everything she does is just up for consumption. It's up for us to see for our viewing pleasure, all of the nasty atrocities she's participating in. But I think the show never formally denounces that she is giving into a demand of these people who are watching her online. And I think just as a person to person, I think like me making YouTube videos with a messy room, although Cassie is a hateable character for a plethora of reasons, depending on your perspective, I think there is something to be said for a character that just puts it all out there. And I think I admire that. And I notice with kind of this late stage capitalist technological surveillance society we're living in IRL, I think there's very much a fascination with the mysterious woman who is modest online. She has power, she has aura, she has mystique, which is ultimately still performing for the male gaze. Like me right now, I wouldn't say I'm performing for the male gaze. I'm just me, right? But I would say, if I were wearing like a deep V-neck blazer like Maddie always does and have my hair done perfectly and makeup, that is still a performance for the male gaze. So I notice maybe besides Rue, who almost gives kind of androgynous qualities to me, Sam Levinson girls are very much tools, part of the decor, part of the scenery, part of the costuming almost, It's, and what they wear really doesn't matter. I notice like their body and their femininity as a woman he deems an ornament, like a thin woman or a woman with a big butt, whatever. It's kind of part of the scenery. So that's one thing I wanted to comment on. Another version of this is Faye, who is, she has no agency in her own story. I don't think that requires a lot of explanation. And it's interesting that they did pick an actual sex worker from real life to be in the show. I do think that was good because why not get an authentic person to be a character in your show that largely is capitalizing on the spectacle of the existence of sex work. And one thing about Euphoria I find interesting is, and I actually read a lot about perspectives of all these things. I find it interesting what's going on in my community that may have nothing to do with me, right? The fentanyl billboard above the beautiful little coffee shop in your neighborhood. But I think Euphoria kind of brings things that are very sensationalized, like drugs or sex work, to the American public. I mean, me sitting on my couch, like eating chips and watching these crazy situations that I would never get into on a normal Sunday afternoon. It's a form of escapism ultimately, but we might have to critique the ethics of that when we are actively giving in to kind of the associated violence with it. So for example, I feel there's an undertone of victim blaming towards sex workers on the show, and that their plot is used more to kind of sensationalize and make this exciting, disgusting, magnificent narrative out of what it is. And I notice, they show the women doing their makeup, but it's very much in a male gaze kind of way. They never show them like farting. When they show someone farting, it's to be, yucky, add to the craziness of the plot, but they never show the women who are sexualized in kind of a unsatisfactory light. They never give them a perspective. When Cassie is trying to seduce a man and, even using drugs, they never say what's going on in her head. Like, oh, I've got to do this to save my family. It's just her giving into the dogma and the spotlight of being this blonde bimbo on the internet. So enough said with that. I think too that Sam Levinson does a good job of creating a Western. I'm not a big fan of Westerns. I've never really watched them. They're, in my opinion, way past my time. But I really enjoyed and thus find it Quentin Tarantino-esque that he would desire to create such a sensationalized universe out of modern Americana. So using traditional themes such as religion, the sublimity and vastness of the desert, you know, the American home, like the 80s kind of American home, the setting of California. I find all of this very endearing to watch. And the last scene in the club, I found absolutely magnificent. I was standing up, I was putting lotion on, and I was cheering and screaming, and I was just like, edge of my seat doesn't even do it justice. It was outstanding. And no matter how much I think Sam Levinson drops the bag at doing the easy parts, like giving women a voice, I really do think he ate. I do. I can't lie. I've loved Euphoria. And I was explaining to my friends this weekend how it's funny that Euphoria kind of popularized the messy party girl aesthetic with the smeared glitter makeup back in the day to convey a woman who is unwell. And I know I always hear jokes about men conveying a woman is unwell with a very glamorized perspective. So you see me in my room back here, and this would be the epitome of woman who's unwell, but I'm just busy and I work. But on a show, if a woman is unwell, she would not show signs of neglecting domestic tasks even, or starting to look not good, not perform for the male gaze. She would, you know, smoke a cigarette and dance around her house, and a la Queen's Gambit, if you've seen that, the scene where she's off the rails and they're always eating like messy Chinese food container, you know. So it's just things like that. But overall, I do think the camp of it is what keeps us coming back. I think for me, that was really what sold me, because a lot of shows are very much like late stage capitalist corporate slop, where they just have a certain lens to them. And I always tell my friends I really don't enjoy a lot of modern media because it tends to not bring a certain grittiness and characterization and really sucking you into the plot in the way that a lot of vintage films did. Also, I heard this weekend that Backrooms and Obsession, which were both all like alternatively produced films, made it to the top of the box office. So maybe we're having a cultural renewal where we are yearning for media that has some character and authenticity to it, which I would find fantastic, because the kind of movies I tend to enjoy are very much like just weird, like in a different setting than where I live. For me, I think a lot of people enjoy Euphoria because it exposes us to these real world issues we would never partake in, like, you know, drugs or sex. But for me, I like shows that bring me into a setting and a character I might not meet. So it's not as much as, ooh, they showed violence, that's cool. I've been disappointed by a lot of movies throughout the year that were very hyped up culturally, and to find that it was just meh, you know? And again, with a lot of modern horror movies, I think they rely on crappy jump scares, loud music, and just like violence, gore to convey. And I think too, we've got to start centering female perspectives, because women and men do perceive the world completely different. And I've noticed this with like things I talk about versus, you know, guy friends versus girlfriends. And it's very much apparent to me that men tend to exempt themselves from small details. I remember reading a story in high school. I can't recall what it was called. I want to say like The Dollhouse? Was that it? Or was it something else? It might have been something else. But the whole point of the story was a woman could kind of figure something out because she looked at little details. And another good, funny example of that is Legally Blonde, where she can tell that this crime didn't happen because the girl's perm didn't have enough time to dry. I mean, it really is the little details. Like, if a man were to show a woman leaving the house like this, a woman would know, okay, she's probably not going to see her boyfriend. She's going to the grocery store. But a man might say, oh, there's a pretty girl leaving the house at night. She's going to do evil crime. You know what I mean? So it's just things like that that I think we do need to be mindful of. Another thing we need to be mindful of from a white perspective is, I'm pretty sure Sam Levinson is a white man. And again, I know he was critiqued immensely for kind of sexualizing high schoolers in the original seasons, where he depicted students, you know, who are supposed to be high schoolers. Obviously, they were actors of age, but they were partaking in sexualized scenarios. And there was a lot of questioning. Why could we not make these college characters where at least they were of age? Like, why do we want to watch characters who we were told are underage or very much on the cusp of being of age? And again, even a college student is not very much a grown adult. Legally, they are, but you know, I saw something online today saying a 24-year-old was dating an 18-year-old, and I find that disgusting. Like, there is a huge maturity gap between an 18-year-old and like even a 23-year-old, you know? So I just asked myself, why did we have to create that in the first place? But I do think Black people written by white people. That's what I have in my book for my note of this. I notice a lot of cinematic use of like the N-word or really racist terminology to almost establish the westernness of the series in this season, where it was meant to create shock value and emphasize kind of like different cultural groups as in a Western would. But I really think Sam Levinson kind of did the white people thing, like the meme of a teacher reading To Kill a Mockingbird and saying the N-word for no reason and thinking that's subversive when you don't need to do that. I think Sam Levinson very much crafted I don't want to say racist. I mean, he just included the N-word a lot, which I find interesting because he included a lot of Black characters who were making criticisms about race, and it wasn't very much like, oh, we're being treated poorly. It was like almost pandering to the white man's perception of how Black people would use the N-word or communicate about racial expectations. At no point was, in my opinion, like an actual Black person consulted. Like, how does it feel when someone uses a racial slur towards you? Very much of the discourse was like, we're going to say the N-word and comment on how we're treated as less, but without making a subversive analysis that we're people. Does that make sense? Like, I feel that Sam Levinson with women, sex workers, trans people, and now in this season a lot, because there weren't that many in the previous seasons, creates a narrative of, you know, Black people, women, all that I just mentioned, with very much, that's what I imagine they talk about. I was a little taken aback by how much there were kind of these racialized comments. Like when Lori said she didn't know Black people watch Westerns, you know, the use of the swastika or kind of hate speech with this group of white people. And I feel that things like that, if included in a show, should probably be a little more explicitly denounced to convey that you are not in alignment with those beliefs. I do think there was an irony or a satire that the rednecks were pretty stupid and that they were obviously supporting hate speech. But I do think the criticism from me was, could the Black characters maybe not interact with each other using the N-word with the hard R, like what I imagine a white man imagines Black people talk about in a conversation. So again, I'm kind of explaining that from a non-Black perspective, but from the female perspective, I very much think every interaction is like, oh, this is what I imagine girls talk about. This is what I imagine strippers talk about. You know, we're just talking about how to look good all the time. So I do think he could have benefited from consulting some other people from these groups he's actually using as a caricature to advance his plotline and symbolism in the show. I do know on The Idol, his other controversial show, in which the female body was used as an ornament and there was not an explicit enough condemnation of these negative events, they said the original show was supposed to be written by a woman and it was supposed to make Jocelyn, the main character, more of like an Addison Rae, kind of every woman, like girls role model, and that Sam Levinson took over the plot and made it very much gritty, sexualizing of the main character, dark. And there was kind of that lacking female perspective, which again, a la Quentin Tarantino, can be good. However, I think often men cause it to fall flat. And not because they're men, but just because occasionally there's details they don't know about. Which for me, you know, I think 50% of the audience that's female, if not more, because I think Euphoria is very much meant for a female audience, despite kind of making the women the villains, the bimbos, the people with no agency in their own plot, not very likable, not very realistic. So I just think he can benefit, you know, it's a message to all filmmakers and TV makers. You can ask a person of color or a woman or a trans person or a sex worker what their experience is like and provide a little more context into that. Treatment of sex workers, I think there's a million video essays done that can sum it up better than I can, but I do think it's annoying to sensationalize a topic you're bringing to the majority of America and not kind of educate them or provide a nice perspective. And not saying that everything about that is nice, but I think you could have done a better job the same way he did with fentanyl, where I actually appreciate him kind of breaking the fourth wall to condemn fentanyl use and, the amount of murders that have happened from it. I asked myself why he couldn't have done that with sex work and how sex workers are mistreated and things like that. And I think even, we always tend to center the perspectives of the people on the pedestal of the classes. So the white woman who meets all the beauty standards inside her house making online content. We're not showing any perspectives of like women on the street fighting for their life who might be representative of multiple of our characters, like Rue, who is experiencing struggles with addiction, or Jules, who is a trans woman. We're not talking about this. It's always like blonde woman who wants to do sex work because she's greedy. So I just, yeah. And can men use trauma? P word. That's kind of another note I wrote down. Why is everything so sensationalized? I do think with the amount of kind of nasty stuff they included to be jarring in the first episode about how drug mules have to do all these things in order to transport drugs illegally across a border, I'm glad they formally denounced the drug use. I think at a certain point you do have a moral responsibility to kind of address the issues you're bringing up in your show if you're going to create that vivid of an image for people. One thing I noticed that was funny too is obviously the show was made a while ago, but I find it extremely culturally relevant because honestly the cultural zeitgeist does not change that quickly. Issues that were relevant, probably 4 years ago are still relevant now. And I find it interesting how the kind of trad wife girls on the Texas farm were almost the only deviation from this capitalist exploitation and simultaneous like sexualization through patriarchy that a lot of the women characters in the show were experiencing. So it's almost like the only solution was to revert back to tradition. And I am disappointed that he always, like when I first watched Euphoria, I felt that the drug use and everything was it was needed. We needed, not drug use is needed, but it was needed to have a show that conveys the kids aren't all right, But I think nowadays I'm disappointed that instead of showing the long-term consequences of negative things that happen in society, interpersonal violence, that these women are almost like not likable characters. They're not protagonists we're rooting for. They all kind of ended up in a horrible situation. And I wish we could have a more positive representation of alternative lifestyles for Gen Z. I think having a trans character and then having her be kind of like a kept woman and just like nothing kind of coming out of that. I mean, that feels realistic to me because I watched this from a critical lens thinking to myself, okay, what options are there for trans women? Like, can a trans woman in this transphobic society truly self-actualize to a point that none of the female characters even did, cisgender female characters even did in the show, where it's like her dream would be being a kept woman with the lowest thing she could end up as being like Cassie, like a sex worker, So I do think there's some truth to that highlights who is the most self-actualized on the show, who is able to truly tell their own story and not get it told for them or not get pushed into one of these two pipelines of being a kept woman, a sex worker, dead, And I find it interesting that kind of like one of the few women who was well in the show was like the little farmer's daughter, trad wife girl on the farm, So really none of these characters get a happy ending, and I feel that that could be representative of kind of the society we're living in. But I just think I think things could have been done with more nuance. And my main criticisms of the show were, did everything have to be shown? Did everything have to happen? I think the show could have been twice as juicy and compelling if he didn't go the Tarantino way with all of the scenes creating the most possible shock value and spectacle. The scenes that were very dramatic with Rue that were very Western, like a showdown. Uh, I did enjoy them. They created a lot of suspense. I do think it's funny. I see posts online that say Euphoria is witchcraft and it siphons your energy. I think that's just called an interesting show. I never knew what to do with my life after watching this. You know, my streaming service would cycle into the next recommended show, and I'd always be sitting there like, I wanted to watch all the credits, you know? I was just like, wow, I need a breather after that. I never know what to do with the rest of my day. So overall, I loved watching Euphoria. It packs a punch to the gut every single episode. I was a little surprised with the last episode how things went down. I think it followed a different plot where it kind of started out with a punch and kind of like crumbled away at the end, which was honestly an interesting, different thing because I think the foreshadowing and buildup of the Western-esque scenes where Rue is just getting brutalized by her boss could, you know, it kind of baits and switches you with how things go. So I do like it. I think it's wonderful storytelling. I mean, the characters are so compelling. They're annoying. I think real people in real life do have more nuance, but also don't. There are people in real life that are more a caricature of their circumstances. So I honestly, you know, I want to really hate this show, but I liked it. I liked watching it. I think it was just entertaining. I mean, anything is on the table. If you want to use the issues we're all talking about and thinking about to make something up, all the more power to you. And I find that culturally in America, every 4 years we swap, you know, 90s, super liberal, 9/11, very conservative, Obama era, liberal, you know, 2016, all that kind of liberal. Now we're more conservative. So I do think in a weird way that Sam Levinson, you know, bringing up these issues in a way that we weren't satisfied with has even created a ripple effect of opening up a lot more discourse on social media, where I have seen countless video essays from people like me on how, you know, he does not show sex workers well, or he does not show women well. I've heard less like feminist criticisms, and that's honestly one of the biggest criticisms I have. But one show I want to recommend if you like Euphoria that in my opinion actually did a way more nuanced and positive job showing marginalized communities and serious issues was Pose, which was made by I think the people who made American Horror Story, but that show is outstanding. And watching Euphoria makes me want to watch Pose again because it definitely had me glued to the screen, but it also kind of had some uplifting messages. And I think the witchcraft Euphoria discussion is really from the pit you feel at the end. And I think Sam Levinson does not create a pit in your stomach by raising your awareness to the issues that could be going on in the neighborhood across from yours. But I think ultimately his use of kind of sensationalized, disgusting imagery and situations that don't always provide a clear scapegoat on who is doing this interpersonal violence to marginalized communities is what leaves you with the pit. I don't think it's witchcraft. I think it's that typically people from one kind of group tell stories about everyone else, whether or not they are experts on the topic. Oh, and one last thing I wanted to add. Yeah, I love the camp of it all. I love the Americana. I love it, love it, love it. I think that was just very cool. And he made a fantastic show. Like, I couldn't have done it better myself. Might have centered the voices of African Americans, sex workers, trans people, women a little more, but, you know, and not made it as disgusting. Because I think the scenes for me that were really like a punch to the gut were not the disgusting scenes I looked away from because they were so graphic, but like the the suspense, you know, the music, this dramatic sting, like that was the stuff that really had me sat. And I was like, I hope this can end already. My heart's beating like this. I'm like raising my cortisol watching this show, which again, I don't think is witchcraft. We've got to stop calling everything witchcraft just because it shows like drug addiction. These are real issues happening in our country that time and time again we've tried to ignore. I've heard lots of presidents have neglected to get things like safe needle injection sites that could actually reduce the harm of people who are addicted to drugs. And they've constantly said no countless times because they didn't want to acknowledge it's a problem in their own country, which severely disappoints me. And same with like the treatment of sex workers. I think a lot of times we don't want to acknowledge these things are happening in our country, but as long as we don't, we are choosing to do harm. Like, sidebar, lately my friends have been getting me into going vegan, and I realized, I told them the other day, I was like, I'm never wrong about anything. And you guys made me realize I might be wrong, so I have to get right real quick. But I noticed with like the meat and dairy industry, a lot of people don't want to watch what's going on with it. And I think with everything in the world, the Middle East, the meat and dairy industry, the treatment of LGBT people and sex workers, the treatment of Black people. I heard in the news recently a young Black boy was murdered for allegedly, they thought he was stealing water bottles. And I'm not quite informed on the situation, but he ran, he was shot, and it was just a horrible situation. And no matter how you feel about these things, it's important to be informed. It's important to sit down with a dirty bedroom and make a video out into the world, because everything nowadays is so sanitized. And Sam Levinson is kind of exploiting the trauma that people in communities other than his go through to create a shock value on his show and increase the ratings, and it works. But this is why I tell you, if you don't like it, go talk about it. Go show people. Bring them the information so that they cannot ignore it, you know? And that would have been a really good place to end the video. But I was also just going to say, I like how they use God in the show. I think a lot of Gen Z are skeptical or confused about their religion and their relationship with Christianity. And I think it's interesting how Christianity was used as a very Western Americana symbol. And again, it's like it could have been Islam, it could have been anything, you know. But I do think it's kind of cool how God was used as an almost Southern Gothic or Western symbol of the mysticism and uncertainty that young people have in the world right now. Where do we go? You know, almost it's a barren desert like they showed on the show. It's dry. You have sex work and drug use and marriage. Well, no, the marriage was like the traditional part. You have all these new wave things that Levinson seems to almost denounce, that you're not going to get a happy ending if you go this left-wing, liberal, alternative path of sin. And then on the other hand, you have God, you have denouncing crime, you have the traditional way, and that's kind of offered as this lifeline that none of the characters can quite cling to. And Rue ultimately chooses to be complicit in the evil that is her downfall. So I do think there's kind of a message being sent, but it's like, I know a lot of people living alternative lifestyles that are very much happy and good people. They're not morally deficient. So I think Levinson could have gone a little harder, but he went pretty hard. And overall, I do recommend Euphoria. So thank you so much for watching my video. This is my dream to make a video like this, because videos like this have been my absolute favorite thing on YouTube for as far as I can remember. I'll watch a video on a show I didn't even watch and be cleaning my house. I do that and be sad. So thank you guys. Take care. Be well. I really appreciate your time, and keep speaking up. Be a yapper. Be a menace. Be a nuisance. Have a good one. I love you. Mwah.